Hi, I'm Phil Harbottle, and this is my 33rd video discussing 1950s British science fiction. In this video, I'll be continuing my investigations into how nearly all British hardcover publishers were scrambling to publish their own science fiction books after having ignored the genre for years. Let's take a look at how they set about it. But before we get to the books in this video, I'd like to apologise for having missed out one of the best Grayson and Grayson titles in my video number 31. This book had been lodged in a different bookcase to that where I'd shelved my collection of all the other Grayson titles. Here's the missing book, The Galaxy Science Fiction Omnibus, edited by H.L. Gould, with its beautiful Harold Johns dust jacket. A hefty 350 pages and priced 13 and 6. It's a superb collection of the top writers of the day. Let's just have a look at the contents page and you'll see all the top names who were contributing to Galaxy. It's a superb collection. Okay, now back to today's video. By 1953, a bandwagon had definitely begun to roll as another venerable publisher, John Lane's The Bodley Head, entered the fray, labelling their selections as the Bodley Head Science Fiction Club, which you see there, with a spaceship logo. Now their lists were dominated by recent American books, mostly anthologies. They opened in February with Adventures in Tomorrow by Kendall Foster Crossan and followed it in August with Crucible of Power, edited by Martin Greenberg. This was billed as 3 science fiction novels, but there were actually 3 novelettes by Jack Williamson, pulp legend Norvell W. Page, and Norman L. Knight. This was one of the earliest examples of the 3 long stories anthologies. October 1953 brought another pair of seemingly obligatory American anthologies, both edited by the established pairing of Blyler and Dickey, Men of Space and Time and Imagination Unlimited. The following month brought their first novel, Wilson Tucker's The Long Loud Silence, a minor classic. Although a long-time science fiction fan and author in the United States, Tucker was better known in the UK for his detective novels, but the quality of his novel was recognised when the prestigious British Publishers Guild issued it in a simultaneous quality paperback edition as a Guild original, with the cover billing it as a science fiction novel of suspense and excitement. This now rare paperback seems to be unknown to most dealers and collectors, but it's well worth trying to find it. 1934 brought only a single science fiction club title, another Kendall Foster Crossan edited anthology, Future Tense. Evidently the Bodley Head's enthusiasm for science fiction was waning, because their next title, The Long Way Back, an original British novel by the noted mystery novelist and literary critic Margot Bennett, was published as a mainstream title with the obligatory arty dust jacket. The fact that Bennett's fine novel was science fiction was demonstrated when it was subsequently selected for reprinting in Sidgwick and Jackson's Science Fiction Book Club, which made a nonsense of the publisher's caution. Its sale may have nudged Bodley Head into resuming the Science Fiction Club imprint, as they issued another 4 books between March and May 1955. Category Phoenix, in March, edited by Blyler and Dickey, contained 3 novelettes reprinted from 1952 issues of Astounding and Galaxy, all billed as novels. Firewater by William Tenn, Category Phoenix by Boyd Ellenby, and Surface Tension by James Blish. But the remaining 3 club titles were all novels. Steve Frazee's The Sky Block in April was a US reprint, but Angela's Moon in May was a British original an ambitious, if not entirely successful, first science fiction novel by Alec Brown. The last title was another US reprint, Hellflower, by George O. Smith, which scarcely deserved its original printing and starting stories, much less its reprinting in UK hardcover. Bodley Head thereafter folded the science fiction club, but a later borderline science fiction title of considerable interest was Extinction Bomber by British writer S.B. Huff, and that was published in 1956 as a straight novel. In 1955, the firm of W. Fultrum and Company Limited, who were publishing hardcover mysteries and westerns for the library market, decided to add science fiction to their lists. They approached Sam Youde, who wrote as John Christopher. Christopher's career was beginning to take off, and he would enjoy international acclaim and success. He was simply too busy with more lucrative markets, so in turning them down, he suggested to Fultrum that they should use his friend at the London Circle, Sidney J. Bounds. Bounds was interviewed by the two brothers who ran Fultrum's and was hired to write these two novels. They were published as The Moon Raiders in 1955 and The World Wreckers in 1956. Both were unabashed space opera, but written with great verve and panache. But by the time Bounds had written and offered them a third and more ambitious novel, The Robot Brains, the hardcover market for science fiction was dead, and it was rejected. Bounds finally placed it with a down-market paperback publisher, Digit Books, in 1957. But the book became a bestseller for Digit, who reprinted it twice with new covers and sold it to the USA and other countries. Unfortunately, Bounds had accepted a flat fee, but he received some compensation when he was able to sell Digit his two earlier Fultrum novels, which we see here, with nice covers by Robert Osborne and Sam Peffer. Digit Books are long gone, but all three books are still in print in new editions today. Like other established publishers, Heinemann's had already been publishing science fiction for some years previously, but always with carefully worded blurbs referring to it as Wellsian, parables, etc., as did their contemporaries. Apart from regular H.G. Wells reprints, in a 1951 edition of S. Fowler Wright's collection The Throne of Saturn, the blurb of which carefully contrived to avoid referring to the contents of science fiction by calling them stories based on scientific possibilities in the future. In other words, it was science fiction. Their most notable other titles had included the Antigius series by Paul Capon. Capon was better known as a detective novelist, but had switched genres with some panache. His first science fiction novel, The Other Side of the Sun, which we see here, published 1948, having been serialised on radio by the BBC. It had a sequel, The Other Half of the Planet, in 1952. But suddenly, in November 1954, when the hardcover science fiction boom was already well on the wane with most publishers, Heinemann started to include a bold Planet Saturn logo with the legend Heinemann Science Fiction on their jackets, and they promoted their books as part of a new science fiction series. Let's have a look at the inside back flap. This set out their admirable manifesto. Science fiction has a long and mixed history. It had one great master in Wells and a number of competent practitioners. Today it exists at many levels, a vehicle of pure escape and relaxation, of creative reverie, of social comment and reflection, of alert scientific speculation, and of excellent entertainment. It's as well written as any prose produced today. The purpose of this series is to present novels and short stories which will combine some or all of these qualities at a level thoroughly acceptable to any reader of good fiction. We can be certain of one thing about the future. It will be more various, more surprising than the past has ever been. To that future, science fiction presents a key. Possibly they had been prompted to enter the field because of the success of Capen's books, which by then included a juvenile all-out science fiction novel, The World at Bay. Which you see here, there's The World at Bay. Whatever the reasons, they opened a science fiction program with the concluding part of Capen's Antigious trilogy, Down to Earth. The dust jacket announced 3 titles as forthcoming. Which you see at the bottom there. And surprisingly, the first 2 were also original British novels. Utopia 239 by Rex Gordon and Dark Dominion by David Duncan appeared in April 1955. Some thought Duncan was new to science fiction, but he was already an experienced novelist who had published some excellent borderline, unidentified science fiction with other publishers, such as The Shade of Time, issued by the Grey Walls Press in 1948 as a detective thriller. Gordon, too, was already an established author under his real name of S.B. Huff, who was so earlier. Now, Heinemann followed this promising opening with a string of excellent, varied American reprints. Bring the Jubilee started it off by Ward Moore in June, The Space Merchants by Poland Kornbluth in September, and Lest Darkness Fall by L. Sprague de Camp in October. The publishers showed considerable enterprise by doing the first hardcover book edition of Powell Anderson's famous novel, Brainwave, in November 1955. This story had originally appeared as an incomplete US magazine serial in the last issue of Lester Del Rey's short-lived but admirable space science fiction, As the Escape. Just have a look. Yeah, bear with me. There you can see it being serialised. That was part 1 of the serial of the novel, As the Escape, and it was illustrated by Paul Orban, famous American artist. But that was the last issue of the magazine, and the serial was never completed, so it was left to Ballantine Books to publish it as a complete paperback original in 1954. This first hardcover makes Heinemann's edition an instant collectible. Another top-class American writer, Clifford Simak, appeared in January 1956 with Time and Again, a masterly time travel story originally serialized in Galaxy. Sadly, it was the last new title in the labeled science fiction series, which they abandoned thereafter, though they did continue to use the Saturn Heinemann science fiction logo on their later reprints of H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, with a film tie-in cover. The juvenile book, which you see here, Phobos the Robot Planet by Paul Capen, had appeared in 1955, but it didn't carry the adult Saturn science fiction logo, so it was not strictly part of the series. But later, Heinemann also published 3 more science fiction novels by writers who had been part of the earlier series. Another Tree in Eden by David Duncan, June 1956, Paul Capon's adult science fiction novel, Into the 10th Millennium, and Rex Gordon's minor classic, No Man Friday, both in November 1956. Many, including myself, thought that Gordon's book later inspired the Byron Haskin film Robinson Crusoe on Mars. This is Robinson Crusoe, his counterpart on Mars, but he was not credited in the film. These books were all marred by arty dust jackets. The art directors of all these hardcover publishers unaccountably seem to equate decent full-colour artwork with lower quality science fiction or juvenile titles. Just look at that awful cover. This was an annoying convention that persisted for decades. As a collector, this sort of cover snobbery depresses me. But not that Heinemann abandoned science fiction per se. Even as the labelled science fiction series was breathing its last, Heinemann published a 241-page anthology of 21 short stories at a hefty price of 15 shilling. This was AD 2500, built on the perfectly ghastly two-colour arty cover, surprisingly by Mudge Marriott, but evidently painted under instructions as 21 short stories, 21 prize-winning short stories in the Observer competition 1954. It was introduced by Angus Wilson. Who presumably had already judged the newspaper competition. This had invited its readers to submit stories that envisaged life 1,000 years hence. In his long and earnest introduction, Wilson banged on about the deficiencies of most science fiction authors in writing about the human condition and creating believable characters and good characterization, etc., etc. All valid points, no doubt, but the present collection was trumpeted as solving these deficiencies in AD 2500 was a collection of science fiction short stories by writers untouched by the stock conventions of the genre, which Wilson had judged as refreshing. It should convince many a superior reader that science fiction can be serious literature. Needless to say, this bloody awful book, with its awful cover and its awful authors, sank without trace. The only two exceptions were two authors who had been touched by the stock conventions of science fiction, namely Brian Aldiss and Arthur Sellings, both regular writers for the science fiction magazines. I rest my case. Our story of boom and bust will be continued in future videos.